You get that ink out of a cereal box, old-timer? The voice sliced through the low morning hum of Blue Ridge Grill, drawing a few glances from nearby tables. Earl Whitaker didn't look up. At 83 years old, he had long ago learned that not every question deserved an answer. He sat alone in the corner booth near the front window, one weathered hand wrapped around a ceramic coffee mug, his eyes fixed on the rolling Carolina hills beyond the glass. The diner smelled of fresh bacon, hot coffee, and rain-soaked asphalt drifting in every time the door opened. Across from him stood three men in civilian clothes, though there was nothing truly civilian about them. Their posture gave them away. Their eyes gave them away. The quiet confidence of elite soldiers clung to them like a second uniform. The tallest of the three, Sergeant Cole Mercer, folded his arms and stared at the faded tattoo visible beneath Earl's rolled flannel sleeve. The mark had blurred with age. Time had softened its lines into little more than a dark circle wrapped around a five-pointed star. To most people, it looked meaningless. To Cole, it looked suspicious. "I asked you a question," he said. Earl slowly lifted his coffee and took a sip. His movements were calm, deliberate, completely unaffected by the attention. The silence irritated Cole more than any insult could have. Around them, conversations began to fade. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Even the waitress behind the counter glanced over. "Funny thing about tattoos," Earl finally said, setting the mug down. His voice carried the rough edge of age and countless miles traveled. "Most people see what they want to see." One of the younger operators chuckled. Cole smirked. "That's supposed to sound mysterious?" Earl shrugged lightly. "No." The answer landed with a quiet finality that somehow made the younger man look away. For a moment, only the soft hiss of the grill filled the space between them. Then Cole stepped closer. "You know, stolen valor doesn't go over too well around Fort Liberty." Earl's pale blue eyes met his. There was no anger in them. No fear. Only a stillness so complete it felt unsettling. Cole had spent years reading faces. He knew arrogance. He knew deception. He knew confidence. What he saw in the old man didn't fit any category. It bothered him. "That tattoo," Cole continued, pointing toward Earl's forearm. "What unit is it supposed to be?" Earl glanced down at the faded symbol. For the briefest second, something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt. Not embarrassment. Something older. "A place that doesn't exist anymore," he said quietly. A few people exchanged looks. Cole laughed. "Convenient answer." Earl reached for his wallet and laid a few bills beside the empty coffee cup. "Maybe." Then he began to rise from the booth. The movement was slow, but there was dignity in it. The kind that couldn't be taught and didn't need permission. Cole stepped sideways, blocking the aisle before the old man could leave. The smile faded from his face. "No," he said. "I think we're going to talk about that tattoo first." The aisle between the booths suddenly felt narrower. Earl Whitaker stood motionless, one hand resting lightly on the back of the seat he had just left. Across from him, Cole Mercer held his ground. The younger man was taller, stronger, and nearly 60 years younger, but something about the old veteran's calm refusal to react was beginning to irritate him in ways he could not explain. The morning crowd sensed it too. The tension drifting through Blue Ridge Grill was no longer curiosity. It was anticipation. Cole glanced again at the faded symbol on Earl's forearm. The ink looked old, older than any military tattoo he had ever seen. The circle was imperfect. The star inside was worn almost smooth by time. It looked less like a badge of pride and more like a secret somebody had tried to erase. "You know what I think?" Cole asked. Earl said nothing. "I think you wear that because people do not ask questions. Most folks see an old man and assume whatever story you tell them is true." One of the operators behind him shifted uneasily. Ryan Holt had remained quiet since entering the diner. Something about the old veteran bothered him too, but for a different reason. Earl did not act like someone trying to impress anyone. In Ryan's experience, the loudest claims usually came from the people with the least to prove. Earl looked like a man who had spent decades avoiding attention. "Cole," Ryan said quietly. "Maybe let it go." Cole ignored him. His eyes remained locked on Earl. "So what is it?" he asked. "Some secret unit nobody ever heard of?" Earl slowly folded his flannel sleeve lower, covering part of the tattoo. "Something like that." The answer only fueled the younger man's frustration. "That is not an answer." Earl nodded once. "I know." A few people near the counter exchanged glances. Even Sarah Delaney, the owner of the diner, had stopped refilling coffee cups. She watched from behind the register, studying the old man carefully. Earl had been coming here for years. Always the same booth. Always black coffee. Always polite. He knew everyone's name and never talked about himself. Yet now, standing beneath the morning sunlight pouring through the windows, he somehow seemed larger than he had 5 minutes earlier. Not physically. Something else. Something difficult to define. Cole stepped closer. "Funny thing is," he said, "I have spent my entire career around special operations. I know the patches. I know the insignias. I know the history. I have never seen that symbol anywhere." Earl's pale blue eyes drifted briefly toward the front window. The distant hills glowed beneath low gray clouds. "That does not surprise me." "Why?" Earl looked back at him. "Because it was never meant to be seen." The words landed softly, but they changed the air in the room. For the first time, Cole had no immediate response. Ryan frowned. Sarah felt a chill crawl up her arms. Outside, rain began tapping lightly against the glass. Inside, every eye remained fixed on the old veteran whose quiet answers somehow raised more questions than they solved. Rain streaked slowly down the diner windows, turning the distant hills into blurred shades of gray and green. Nobody seemed interested in leaving anymore. Breakfast plates sat forgotten. Coffee cooled untouched. The entire room had become anchored to the strange exchange unfolding beside the front aisle. Cole Mercer felt the shift and mistook it for support. In his mind, he was exposing a fraud. Every minute the old veteran refused to explain himself only strengthened that belief. "Not meant to be seen," he repeated with a dry laugh. "That sounds like something from a bad movie." Earl Whitaker offered no defense. He simply adjusted the cuff of his sleeve and reached for the old brown jacket hanging over the booth seat. The gesture should have ended the conversation. Instead, it made Cole step closer. "You know what bothers me?" he asked. "People who wear symbols they did not earn. Real soldiers spend their whole lives protecting a reputation. Then somebody comes along with a story nobody can verify." Ryan Holt shifted uncomfortably beside him. Several customers exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah Delaney could feel the atmosphere tightening like a cable pulled too far. Earl slipped one arm into his jacket. "You are entitled to your opinion. That is all you have to say?" Cole asked. "You do not care what people think." Earl paused. For a moment his eyes settled on a faded photograph hanging near the register. It showed the diner almost 40 years earlier. Different faces. Different lives. "Most people spend too much time worrying about being remembered," he said quietly. "The older you get, the more you appreciate being forgotten." The answer frustrated Cole even more. It was impossible to argue with someone who refused to fight back. Around them, the silence deepened. The soft hum of refrigeration units and the distant patter of rain became strangely loud. Then Cole noticed something. Earl's jacket sleeve had shifted slightly as he slipped it on. For the briefest second, another section of the tattoo became visible near the inside of his forearm. There appeared to be markings woven into the circle itself. Not letters. Not numbers. Something older. Something deliberate. Cole narrowed his eyes. "Wait." Earl continued putting on his jacket. "Hold on." This time the younger operator reached out, not aggressively, but with the certainty of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Let me see it again." Earl stopped moving. Slowly, he turned his head toward him. The old man's expression remained calm, but something had changed. The temperature of the room seemed to drop several degrees. "No," Earl said. The word was quiet. It was not angry. It was not defensive. It was absolute. Cole blinked. For the first time that morning, he felt something unexpected. Not fear. Not yet. Uncertainty. Ryan felt it too. So did Sarah. Because the refusal had not sounded like a stubborn old man protecting a secret. It had sounded like a man guarding a memory that belonged to people no longer present to defend it. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The rain continued tapping against the windows. Coffee machines hummed behind the counter. Somewhere in the kitchen, a timer chimed and went unanswered. Every sound felt distant. Cole Mercer stared at Earl Whitaker, trying to understand why a simple refusal had unsettled him so deeply. The old veteran stood less than 3 feet away, his jacket half on, his expression unchanged. Yet the atmosphere around him felt different now. He no longer looked like a quiet retiree passing through a small-town diner. He looked like a man standing watch over something invisible. Cole exhaled slowly. "You know what?" he said. "I am tired of riddles." Before Ryan Holt could say a word, Cole reached forward. His hand moved toward the faded mark beneath Earl's sleeve. The motion was casual, almost dismissive. The kind of gesture a man makes when he believes he is in complete control of the situation. His fingertips brushed the edge of the tattoo. The contact lasted less than a second. For everyone else in the diner, nothing happened. For Earl Whitaker, the world vanished. The soft light of Blue Ridge Grill disappeared. The smell of coffee faded. The sound of rain dissolved into something older, something buried beneath decades of silence. He was young again. The air was warm and heavy beneath a dark sky. Moisture clung to every surface. Water dripped steadily from broad leaves overhead. There were no roads, no signs, no names, only endless wilderness stretching beyond sight. 5 figures sat beneath a weathered canvas shelter illuminated by a single dim lantern. Nobody spoke loudly. Nobody needed to. The exhaustion on their faces said enough. Their uniforms carried no identifying marks. Their paperwork did not exist. Their destination would never appear in any history book. One of the younger men sat cross-legged beside the lantern, carefully tracing a circle onto another soldier's forearm. The ink was crude. The tools were improvised. Yet every movement carried purpose. Nobody laughed. Nobody treated it like decoration. It was a promise, a reminder, a bond formed in a place where tomorrow was never guaranteed. Earl remembered the sound of quiet voices, the flicker of lantern light, the steady rhythm of rainfall beyond the shelter. Most of all, he remembered the faces. 5 men, 5 names, 5 lives forever tied together by something larger than themselves. The memory lingered only a moment before dissolving like fog. The diner returned all at once. The smell of coffee, the rain against glass, the concerned faces watching from nearby tables. Cole had already pulled his hand back. He frowned slightly, confused by the sudden change in the old veteran's eyes. Earl blinked once, then again. For the first time that morning, emotion appeared on his face. Not anger, not resentment, sadness, deep and quiet, the kind carried for a lifetime. Ryan saw it immediately. Sarah saw it too. Neither understood its source, but both recognized its weight. Earl slowly lowered his sleeve over the tattoo and buttoned the cuff. His fingers moved carefully, almost reverently. When he finished, he looked at Cole and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Some things belong to the people who are gone. The diner fell completely silent. Even Cole found himself unable to answer. The silence lingered long after Earl Whitaker spoke. Nobody in Blue Ridge Grill seemed willing to break it. Outside, the rain strengthened, streaking across the glass in silver lines. The parking lot shimmered beneath the gray morning sky. Earl stood quietly beside the booth, his hand resting on the back of the seat. His eyes were no longer focused on the people around him. They were somewhere else entirely, somewhere decades away. The memory that had surfaced refused to disappear. He could still see the lantern, still hear the rain striking canvas overhead. 5 men sat inside that shelter all those years ago, exhausted beyond words yet unwilling to sleep. The mission had stretched far longer than anyone expected. Supplies were scarce. Communication was unreliable. The world beyond the jungle felt impossibly distant. Yet none of that was what Earl remembered most clearly. What remained sharp after all these years were the conversations, the quiet promises, the understanding that each man was responsible for the others. One of them had been laughing that night. Another had been sketching the circle and star symbol onto a scrap of paper before carefully reproducing it by hand. Nobody claimed ownership of it. Nobody assigned rank to it. The mark represented something simpler. It meant that no matter what happened afterward, nobody would be forgotten. The memory drifted through Earl's mind like smoke. Faces appeared and vanished. Voices echoed faintly. Then one face remained longer than the others. A young officer with steady eyes and a calm voice. A man who had always carried responsibility more heavily than the rest. Earl had not spoken that name aloud in decades. Back in the diner, Cole Mercer shifted his weight uneasily. The old veteran's expression had changed. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal that the tattoo was more than a story, more than a symbol. It carried history. Ryan Holt noticed it too. The confidence that had fueled Cole's challenge was beginning to fade. Questions were replacing certainty. Behind the counter, Sarah Delaney quietly reached beneath the register. Her fingers brushed an old framed photograph she kept hidden there. The picture had belonged to her father. Growing up, She had heard stories told late at night after family gatherings. Stories about men who served in places nobody discussed publicly. Stories that always ended with the same warning. Some names mattered too much to speak carelessly. Sarah looked from the photograph to Earl, then back again. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. The symbol on his arm, the way he carried himself, the sadness in his eyes. Something felt familiar, not recognizable exactly. Familiar. Across the diner, Earl slowly reached for his coffee cup again. It was cold now. He did not seem to notice. He stared into the dark surface for a long moment before speaking almost to himself. There were 5 of us. The words were soft enough that only the nearest tables heard them. Cole frowned. Ryan looked up. Sarah froze behind the counter. Earl's gaze remained fixed on the coffee. And every year, he said quietly, it gets harder to remember their voices exactly the way they sounded. The words settled over the diner like a layer of dust that nobody wanted to disturb. There were 5 of us. Earl Whitaker had not raised his voice. He had not asked for sympathy. Yet somehow those 6 words carried more weight than everything spoken that morning. Outside, the rain continued falling steadily across the parking lot. Inside, Sarah Delaney could no longer ignore the feeling growing in the back of her mind. She reached beneath the counter and carefully pulled out the old photograph. The edges were worn. The colors had faded with time. It showed a group of military men standing together decades earlier. Her father had kept it hidden among his personal belongings until the day he died. Sarah studied the faces one by one. Most were unfamiliar. Then her eyes stopped. Her pulse quickened. One of the younger men standing near the edge of the picture looked remarkably familiar. The hair had been darker. The face had been younger. But the eyes were unmistakable. Sarah slowly looked up toward Earl. Her breath caught. At the same moment, Ryan Holt noticed the change in her expression. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Sarah did not answer immediately. She continued staring between the photograph and the old veteran. Finally, she turned the picture over. On the back, written in fading blue ink, was a date from more than 50 years earlier and a short note in her father's handwriting. Most of the words had become difficult to read. Only one line remained clear. "Never forget the Circle Star men." Sarah felt a chill travel down her spine. Circle Star. Her eyes drifted toward Earl's covered forearm. Suddenly, the symbol no longer seemed random. It no longer seemed like an old tattoo. It felt connected to something larger. Something important. Cole Mercer noticed the photograph. "What is that?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. "I am not sure." It was the truth. She did not know exactly what she was looking at. But she knew enough to understand that Earl Whitaker was not the man Cole believed him to be. Her father had rarely spoken about his military service. When he did, he always lowered his voice whenever certain subjects came up. Circle Star had been one of them. Sarah remembered that now. She remembered hearing the phrase as a child. She remembered the respect in her father's tone. Without another word, she stepped away from the counter and disappeared into the small office behind the kitchen. The door closed softly behind her. Earl remained standing near the booth, unaware of what she had discovered. Cole watched her leave, confused. Ryan watched too. Inside the office, Sarah sat down and opened an old contacts notebook she had inherited from her father. The pages were yellowed and fragile. Many of the names belonged to people who were no longer alive. She turned carefully through the pages until she found a number she had not called in years. Colonel Nathan Briggs. Her hand hovered over the phone for several seconds. Then she picked up the receiver. The line rang once, twice, 3 times. Finally, a calm voice answered. Sarah swallowed hard. "Colonel Briggs," she said, "I think there is someone in my diner you need to know about." Nearly 12 miles away, inside a secure conference room at Fort Liberty, Colonel Nathan Briggs was reviewing briefing documents when his phone vibrated across the polished table. Around him sat senior officers discussing logistics, schedules, and readiness reports. The conversation stopped when Briggs glanced at the caller identification. He almost ignored it. Almost. Then he recognized the name. Sarah Delaney. He answered immediately. "Sarah?" The room continued talking around him until he heard the uncertainty in her voice. Then he stood. "Slow down," he said quietly. "Tell me exactly what happened." Back at the diner, Sarah carefully described everything she had witnessed. The old veteran. The tattoo. The photograph. The word Circle Star. The silence that followed. As she spoke, the color slowly drained from Briggs's face. One captain sitting nearby noticed it immediately. By the time Sarah finished, Briggs was no longer looking at the meeting table. He was staring through the conference room window toward the rain-covered parade grounds outside. "Are you absolutely certain?" he asked. "Yes." Briggs closed his eyes briefly. Memories surfaced that he had not revisited in years. Stories told by men far above his rank. Names spoken with unusual respect. Files that seemed strangely incomplete. He thanked Sarah and ended the call. For several seconds, he remained completely still. The room had fallen silent. Every officer present was now watching him. "Colonel," one of them asked. Briggs turned slowly toward the head of the table. General Thomas Harlan was seated there, reviewing a folder filled with briefing notes. The four-star general had commanded attention his entire career without ever raising his voice. Briggs approached carefully. "Sir." Harlan looked up. "What is it?" Briggs hesitated. Then he leaned closer and spoke quietly enough that only the general could hear. "Sir, I just received a call from Blue Ridge Grill." Harlan nodded slightly. "And?" Briggs lowered his voice further. "A man named Earl Whitaker is there." The general's expression did not change. At least not immediately. Then Briggs added 3 more words. "Circle star tattoo." The room seemed to freeze. General Harlan slowly set down his pen. The movement was so deliberate that every officer at the table noticed it. Nobody understood why. Nobody dared interrupt. "What did you say?" Harlan asked. Briggs repeated the information. The general stared at him for several long seconds. Then he looked away, as if seeing something far beyond the conference room walls. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Finally, Harlan stood. Chairs shifted around the table. Officers exchanged confused glances. The general gathered nothing. Not his notes. Not his folder. Nothing. "Cancel the remainder of this meeting." Briggs blinked. "Sir." Harlan's eyes returned to him. "Right now." The tone was calm. Absolute. No further explanation was offered. Across the table, a major attempted a cautious question. "General, is there a problem?" Harlan paused near the door. For the first time, something almost resembling emotion crossed his face. Not anger. Not concern. Recognition. "Possibly," he said quietly. "Or perhaps a debt that should have been repaid a very long time ago." Then he opened the door and walked out. Colonel Briggs followed immediately. Neither man noticed the stunned silence left behind in the conference room. Back at Blue Ridge Grill, the rain had become a steady curtain of silver across the windows. Nearly 20 minutes had passed since Sarah Delaney disappeared into her office. Nobody had left. Nobody seemed capable of leaving. The strange gravity surrounding Earl Whitaker held the entire diner in place. He had returned to his booth and sat quietly with his hands wrapped around the cold coffee cup. The conversation was over as far as he was concerned. Yet the questions remained hanging in the air. Cole Mercer stood near the aisle, struggling with emotions he could not fully explain. His confidence had begun to erode. The certainty that had driven him earlier no longer felt as solid. Across the room, Ryan Holt watched the old veteran carefully. The more he observed him, the less he resembled the image Cole had created in his mind. Earl carried himself with a kind of stillness Ryan had only seen a handful of times before. Not in training. Not during evaluations. Among older men. Men whose experience was measured in decades rather than accomplishments listed on paper. The bell above the diner door suddenly rang. Every head turned instinctively. A black government sedan had pulled into the parking lot. Then another. And another. The vehicle stopped outside beneath the falling rain. Conversations died completely. Sarah stepped out of her office at exactly the same moment and froze when she looked through the window. Her face went pale. Cole followed her gaze. Men in military uniforms were exiting the vehicles. Not junior personnel. Senior officers. One carried the insignia of a colonel. Another appeared to be a command sergeant major. The diner fell silent as the front door opened again. Rain-scented air swept inside. Colonel Nathan Briggs entered first. His uniform was immaculate despite the weather. The moment he stepped through the doorway, his eyes began searching the room. They found Earl immediately. Briggs stopped walking. For a brief second, the colonel simply stared. Then he removed his cover. Every military member present noticed. Cole felt his stomach tighten. Something was very wrong. Or perhaps very right. He could no longer tell which. Behind Briggs, another figure entered the diner. The room seemed to shrink. Even civilians recognized the authority that arrived with him. General Thomas Harlan stepped inside, without hurry. For stars rested on his shoulders. Rainwater glistened on his coat. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Earl looked up from his booth. For the first time all morning, surprise appeared on his face. The general's expression softened immediately, not into a smile, into recognition, deep and unmistakable. Briggs remained near the entrance. He was no longer the highest-ranking person in the room, yet even he seemed affected by what he was witnessing. General Harlan ignored everyone else. He did not look at Cole. He did not look at the customers. He walked directly across the diner floor toward Earl Whitaker. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the silence. Earl slowly rose from the booth. The two men faced each other only a few feet apart. Decades seemed to hang between them. Then General Harlan spoke a name nobody else in the diner understood. Vanguard 5. The words landed like a thunderclap. Earl's eyes widened. The old veteran stared at the general for several long seconds before quietly answering. I have not heard that name in over 50 years. The diner remained perfectly still. Rain tapped softly against the windows while nobody dared interrupt what was unfolding before them. General Thomas Harlan stood facing Earl Whitaker, and for a moment neither man spoke. They simply looked at each other, two survivors carrying memories older than most people in the room. Colonel Nathan Briggs watched quietly from the entrance. Even he seemed reluctant to break the silence. Earl slowly shook his head. I never thought I would hear that call sign again. Harlan nodded. Neither did I. Across the room, Cole Mercer felt every certainty he had brought into the diner slipping away. He had expected an explanation. Instead, he was witnessing something far beyond his understanding. The old veteran he had challenged was standing face to face with a four-star general who spoke to him as an equal. Nobody in the room could ignore that reality any longer. Harlan glanced briefly toward the booth. His eyes settled on Earl's forearm. Do you still carry it? He asked quietly. Earl looked down at his sleeve. For the first time, a faint smile appeared on his weathered face. Every day. The general nodded once. Then, without another word, he slowly removed his coat. The movement was deliberate, calm. The room watched in complete silence. Harlan rolled up the sleeve of his uniform shirt. Inch by inch, the fabric moved upward. Nobody understood what they were about to see. Then the symbol appeared. A faded circle. A weathered star. Time had softened its edges just as it had on Earl's arm, but there was no mistaking it. It was identical. The reaction was immediate. Several customers gasped softly. Ryan Holt stared in disbelief. Sarah Delaney closed her eyes for a moment as if a question that had haunted her for years had finally been answered. Cole Mercer felt the blood drain from his face. His eyes moved from Earl's arm to the general's and back again. The symbols matched perfectly. The room seemed frozen in time. Harlan lowered his arm and looked directly at the younger operator. There was no anger in his expression, no desire to humiliate him, only quiet certainty. There were 5 men, the general said. 5 names that never appeared where they should have. 5 men who carried responsibilities few people would ever understand. His gaze shifted toward Earl. And this man brought the rest of us home. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Earl looked away, uncomfortable with the attention. The reaction alone told everyone more than any speech could have. Harlan stepped forward and extended his hand. Earl hesitated only briefly before accepting it. The handshake lasted several seconds. It was not ceremonial. It was not political. It was the greeting of 2 men connected by half a century of loyalty. Cole lowered his eyes. The arrogance that had filled him earlier was gone. In its place stood something far more valuable. Understanding. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. Sunlight pushed through the clouds and spilled across the diner windows. Inside, nobody cared about breakfast anymore. They had witnessed something far rarer than a story. They had witnessed respect finding its rightful place. And in the quiet that followed, Earl Whitaker simply picked up his cold coffee cup and sat back down, as though none of it had ever been about him.